Right now, let's bring in Fred Kempe. He is president and CEO of the Atlantic Council. He's also a CNBC contributor. Fred, what do you think happened? What caused these tweets yesterday?
I think this is classic Trump. His negotiators came back. They found a much harder line Chinese approach. One of the things that's changed that's interesting is the Commerce Minister Zhang Sheng has taken over and is more of a player in the talks. And he's been put in there more as a hardliner, a person who'll stick very much to the facts. And any big deal he'll take back to senior Chinese leadership. Chinese leadership has done a shift in thinking since May, where they believe more and more that the United States is actually out to undermine their rise. And they also decided, well, let's wait out President Trump. Our economy's okay. We think it's bottomed out. Things are going in the right direction. And I think Trump's answer yesterday was, well, you're not going to be able to wait me out. I'm going to make sure that's not easy for you.
So what do you think happens next?
I think you will have countermeasures. Let's see what comes before September. Under the current atmosphere where the Chinese are not only just looking at this trade situation, they're also taking a look at protests in Hong Kong. They're worried about independence moves in Taiwan. They're seeing themselves more and more in a generational struggle with the United States, not just over what happens in the markets the next day or in the trade talks, but more of a generational struggle between authoritarian capitalism and democratic capitalism. And they feel that they've got a little bit of momentum behind them. At current trajectories, within 5 years, non-free countries, as rated by Freedom House, will have the majority of global GDP for the first time in a century. So on the one hand, they see themselves ascendant, and on the other hand, they see the U.S. out to undermine them.
Fred, in terms of the timing of all this, there seems to be this, well, there's the election in the U.S., and there's how the Trump administration thinks about the election, and there's also how the Chinese government, President Xi, thinks about the election and where both sides may or may not have leverage. To the extent if you were advising either side, you would tell them what?
Well, I'd say this is longer term. Don't look so short term. The Chinese are saying the president can't hit consumers ahead of the election, can't hit the farm country. I think the president just said, I'm willing to do that because I think the economy is strong enough. And if I'm tough enough, I'm going to put Jay Powell in a position where he's going to have to give me more. He's going to have to give me more rate cuts.
So did the Chinese miscalculate then? Because, I mean, the other issue is we saw President Trump in Ohio last night. He now has a real boogeyman, and that can be a very powerful thing.
Sadly, I think both sides are miscalculating. They're so dug in, and their own political bases. Trump has his political bases cheering him on, but so does Xi. Xi can't show weakness right now. They're in their big retreat, their leadership retreat in Beijing, and they do that the first 2 weeks of every August. They make major decisions then. They're looking at a dispute with the United States, which they didn't want and they don't know how to get out of. But they're looking at a dispute in Hong Kong where they've got troops poised on the borders, and they have to decide whether to go in or not. And from their standpoint, this is a bigger deal. But they're even blaming the U.S. for that. They're saying there's a U.S. dark hand behind that, which is not true. But it's become much more Cold War atmosphere. What I would watch for, if I were U.S. companies, is non-tariff measures to answer. So Trump is figuring, well, it's on a one-to-one basis, I've got the strength because we have more goods to tax than they have of ours to tax.
Non-tariff measures like bringing in North Korea?
Well, it's not so much North Korea, but they have an unreliable entities list. They could put more American companies there, licensing problems, harassment of U.S. employees, U.S. company employees, just making life more difficult for companies, many U.S. companies that are operating on the ground in Beijing and throughout China that don't fall under any of these trade deals.
So, Fred, you in your comments, you said that China does have more to lose near term in terms of the economy, so are they willing to? You said that Trump's saying you're not going to be able to wait. Are they going to wait? They're going to be willing to wait and take the pain between now and November of 2020.
So I have a friend over the years in China, Chinese. He's relatively high-ranking, and he says that they look at economic indicators as political indicators. So they have 6.2% growth in the last quarter. That's the slowest growth they've had since 1992. They have a lot of stimulus they can throw at this. They can do more to juice up the domestic economy with infrastructure spending and that sort of thing. But then they reach the danger of driving up debt. And so they are in a position where they feel they were better off than the end of last year economically. But if the tariffs start being jacked up again, if people start disinvesting, you have a decoupling of the U.S. economy from the Chinese economy. A lot of companies, whether it's Cummins, Diesel, whether it's Apple, are reducing their supply chains through China. So the economic hit's going to be far more than the tariffs.
Yeah, and so they're willing to take that. I also thought it was funny. You said, what, authoritarian capitalism versus democratic capitalism. I thought you were talking about the debate, but you weren't, because you said because it was still capitalism, right? So you would have said,
well, but before
you would have said socialism.
But before the 2008-2009 financial crisis, I don't think the Chinese thought they had a system that was going to be competitive globally against our system. I actually think they do believe that now, and they think they're really close.
This is the way to go, you think. But Hong Kong might be making them rethink whether it is going to work forever. And not going to work forever. I mean, isn't the writing on the wall? I mean, people are. A lot of people are doing much better in China now than they were decades ago.
Is it like glasnost? Is that
right?
A fair comparison?
How long do the I don't want to call them meager economic gains? There's substantial economic gains, but there's a lot of stuff that isn't, in terms of personal freedom, that just isn't with the rest of the world. And I think that the internet and everything else, I think a lot of people know that by now. How long do they say, all right, I'm willing to exchange that for economic progress?
Well, don't forget, though, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, was the Tiananmen Square crisis. I think now, in retrospect, the crackdown in Tiananmen maybe was as important for the future of the world as was the Berlin Wall falling down. So democracy breaks out in the West, and authoritarianism wins in Beijing.
That's a really interesting point.
And so now we may have another situation like that in Hong Kong. And August is a time when crackdowns happen. And so I'm really watching that very closely. I think what the key thing to say to market players is, I understand people will trade up and will trade down and what people say on trade, but this is a generational contest that's taking place. And you have to start thinking about, well, who profits if we decouple economies? Who profits? I mean, clearly you're seeing more going to Vietnam, to Malaysia, to Mexico. What is going to be the future of our relationship with China? And who, aside from the economy, who's going to take the commanding heights of technology? Because that means that's the company that's going to set the standards and the regulatory standards for the future for AI, for quantum computing, for 5G, and for all sorts of other things. So there's a really exciting space to watch.
Hey, Fred.
I wonder if it's worth it. I mean, do you think this is worth it, what we're doing, or not, Fred, for the future?
I'm very glad the president has finally called China on unfair trade practices. I think we now have to have a strategy where we talk to each other and reach a truce that understands we're going to be at this for a few decades.